Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Good
Good
evening,
evening,
one
one
and
and
all.
all.
Webinars are the order of the day to make us feel that we are not locked up at the time of lockdown. Many of you made a huge effort to join us today. On behalf of on behalf of us all, we are deeply appreciative and offer you my most grateful welcome. My name is Dr. L. Sangeeta, HOD of English, Tiruvallur University Constituent College, Kallakurichi. I am so excited to be here and have the opportunity our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor S. Tamarai Chelvi ma'am, Registrar Dr. Syed Shafi sir, and Dr. Kadiresen, HOD of Higher Authorities of our Tiruvallur University, Vellore, for encouraging people like me to conduct such webinars. I welcome and thank the principal of our college in this occasion. And I am pleased to welcome all the participants to the webinar, without whom the program would be nothing. And you all made me very happy by your presence and feeling honored. Welcome all of you and thank you. It is my duty to welcome and introduce our resource person, Ms. Tamilini Agra. Ms. Tamilini Agra. Sorry, Women's Development Unit, Tiruvallur University, Vellore. She is our resource person, and she is going to give a talk on.
Hope all of you are able to see my presentation.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, transnational literature, an overview of post-colonial Japanese-Canadian writing. Not many of us are aware that even Japanese-Canadian writings were categorized into post-colonial writing, and transnational literature and post-colonial literature are completely contradictory in nature. And today I'll let you know how these two are taken together because it's actually an evolution process. It is slowly evolving into a transnational literature. That was the reason I had this particular topic. So moving into transnational literature, let's get to know what is transnational literature. The study has significantly expanded over time, and it is actually an understanding of literary processes and creation. The massive migration has profoundly changed the cultural landscapes, especially when it comes to transnational approach. This particular transnational literature promises to offer new theoretical and methodological perspectives. So with massive migration, the cultural landscapes are slowly evolving, and it's a completely dynamic status. So that is the reason we have constantly being evolved. The theories which we keep following are completely evolved at every point of time. And the literature of migration is not going to be a common term, because migration literature is a very common term which we could use for almost all the migration type of literatures. But when we talk about the perspectives or the trajectories which the migration literature talking about, it's going to be quite different. So that is the reason, though it is called migration literature, we cannot categorize everything into one single unit, because they differ in their perspectives. So the literatures of migration that draw on cultural influences beyond nationality and national language. And the present scenario, which is wielded by information technology, knowing a culture or sharing a cultural space is not quite difficult for people. It has become excuse me. Sangeeta ma'am.
Ma'am, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
I mean, is my PPT visible?
Yes, ma'am. It is visible, ma'am.
To all the audience. Okay, I'll start continuing. Thank you. So literatures of migration, they cross beyond cultural spaces and also nationality and language. So we don't have a particular cultural space where all the, today in the present scenario, the cultural spaces are being shared by all the cultures. And moreover, while dealing with new literatures in English, new literary paradigms are identified. So that is the reason these post-colonial literatures, or what we call the new literatures, have emerging theories being added to it. So that is the reason all these new literatures are being categorized as transnational literatures. Even though they're called transnational literatures, there are minute differences and differences in their perspectives. So it is just an umbrella term for us to categorize all the works, but they're not going to be a homogeneous entity. And so in short, transnational literatures or transcultural literatures can be called as which encompasses writers who can no longer be related to one particular national literary space. So the notion of nation is actually getting disintegrated. That is a clear evidence of transnational literature. So next, as I said, transnational literatures have multiple trajectories. Like we have transnational neo-nomadic movements, which are actually responsible for these multiple trajectories. Though people are said to migrate from one place to another, the reason behind their immigration is quite different, and the context in which each one writes is going to differ. So definitely this is going to reflect on the literature which they write, and that is a responsible factor for the multiple trajectories that we have in transnational writings. And next is cross-cultural contacts and interactions. Transnational literatures or new literatures in English, it has actually expanded its portfolio and to consider all literatures that deal with cross-cultural contacts and interactions. As I told you earlier, the cultural spaces are being shared by everyone, so it becomes very common for people belonging to different cultures to come into a particular space. So definitely there are problems with cross-cultural been stretched to cover a range of activities and individuals. But then now we have another difference between the diasporic literature and transnational literature. So the next point will tell you the transnational literatures are larger in number, and the diasporic communities form roughly to around say 30% of the transnational literatures. So this is a broader term. Transnational literature is a broader term, and diasporic literature is a component which we find in transnational literatures. So all diasporic literatures are transnational literatures, and not all transnational literatures will become diasporic literatures. And next is the global phenomenon. So the global phenomenon, which we call is the globalization. The globalization is mainly responsible for these transnational literatures or transnational migrations. So because globalization, the entire globe is seen as a homogeneous and single homogeneous entity. So what happens is that when such globalization movements happen, the global phenomenon is localized according to the local distinctions, and that is what we call a localization. This is actually a clipped word, portmanteau word of globalization and localization. So it is localization. So when a few cultures come into a particular cultural space in the name of globalization, so the dominant culture will be localized according to the local distinctions. And at the same time, each and every culture will have its own identity being maintained throughout. The sustenance of identity too. And next is a transnational perspective conceptualizes many contemporary immigrants not as uprooted or as having completely left behind their old countries, but as maintaining multiple links and networks with their homelands. So this is actually going to make transnational literatures quite different from the diasporic literatures. So even though they are migrants, they'll have constant links with their homelands or their native lands. And transnationalism is a mode of adaptation which is quite different from assimilation. So we have in total 3 types of transnationalism. It's economic, political, and socio-cultural. I'm not going to move too deep into transnational types. So going to the next, we'll get to know what is transnationalism, how exactly it is defined. So transnationalism can be defined as a process by which the immigrants build social fields that link together their country of origin and their country of settlement. So transnationalism is a social morphology, a type of consciousness, a mode of cultural reproduction, an avenue of capital, a site of political engagement, a reconstruction of place and locality. So this is not that they're completely cut off from their origin. They are very much linked to their origin back, even though they've been settled in a different place, in a different nation. So next is the notion of a nation, which I've been already talking about. The notion of nation is slowly disintegrating from us. I mean, this is quite contradictory to colonization, because colonization is very much about nation creation process. But here we have the notion of nation, which is slowly disintegrating because of this globalization. Uh, I mean, we're actually living in a post-nationalist tendency where people are not very conscious about the national borders and nationality as a spirit. Territorial sovereignty is declining, and that nations are no longer confined by spatial boundaries. So nations are said to be completely unbound, and that is the reason it is also enabling people to move from one place to another place and settle in harmony. And when we talk about the Canadian literature, the policy which the Canadian government had is quite different when it comes to terms with Japanese immigrants, because now we have Canada as a country which is, I mean, a nation which is supporting the transnational policy. But when it comes to Japanese immigrants or Japanese settlers, Canada had quite a different method to handle people, and which is no different from any other European white attitude of colored races. So now we're moving to Japanese Canadian history. So I would like to touch upon what exactly did Japanese Canadians look like, what are their cultural values, and how exactly were Japanese Canadian family structure or organized, for us to have a better understanding about the torments which they underwent in a Canadian nation. So Nikkei is actually, I mean, there's a photograph of the Japanese Canadian family here, and family meant everything to the Japanese. And Nikkei is a Japanese word which refers to the Japanese immigrants. Japanese immigrants who have settled in Canada, especially Japanese immigrants who had Japanese ancestry and who had Canadian citizenship. It's a common word to refer to Japanese Canadians. And the Japanese had their generations disintegrated, or I mean, distinguished using different names. They had special names for each and every generation. So we call them Issei, Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei, and Gosei. This particular, I mean, nomenclature is actually formed by using 2 words. One is Japanese numerals, and the other part of the word is Japanese word for generation, which is sei, S-E-I. So the first generation is called Issei, the second generation is called Nisei, and Sansei is called the third generation. So as it goes, every generation will have distinct names. And moving to immigrants, it is Manzo Nagano, who is the first settler in Canada, and he happened to get settled. Most of the Japanese were settled in the western coast of Canada, like British Columbia, Vancouver, Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec. And this particular person, Manzo Nakano, he is the first settler to arrive in the Canadian coast, and the main reason for the settlement of Japanese in Canada is business and jobs. So he happened to get settled in British Columbia. Most of the immigrants, first generation immigrants, that is Issei, they were found to settle in Vancouver Island, Fraser Valley, and British Columbia and other parts of Canada. So the reason for these immigration is cheap labor, and they happened to work in rail and mining industries. And the main reason for these immigration is, I mean, the main reason for these immigration is, they were found to settle in Vancouver Island, Fraser Valley, and British Columbia and other parts of Canada. So the reason for these immigration is cheap labor, and they happened to work in rail and mining industries. And move out. And till 1948, the ESA and the NISA did not have the right to vote. They were denied the right to vote, which means to say that they didn't have a proper citizenship there in Canada. Next. Yeah. The second generation and the third generation, that is the Nisei and the Sansei, were identified as the first Canadians with Japanese ancestry. So it was these generations which were given citizenship in Canada, whereas the first generation, that is Issei, did not have citizenship there in Canada. And Sansei, which is considered to be the third generation, 75% of Sansei got married to non-Japanese. So this is a very clear evidence to tell us that the Japanese were not so strict about their cultural beliefs or their family structure. They were quite open enough to get involved with other races or other people who belong to other ancestry too. And Yonsei, which is going to be the fifth generation, was a complete mixed racial descent. When I said mixed, we might be wondering because now we are only talking about Japanese and Canadians. But Yonsei, they have a mixed racial descent in the sense we didn't have only Japanese getting settled in Canada. We had Koreans, we had Chinese, we had Indians, and people from all ancestry. They happened to settle in Canada. So Yonsei is a generation which was quite free with all the other people, and it was a mixed racial descent. Okay, now moving into the tragic history of Japanese Canadians, the word yellow perils, you could see that yellow perils is actually a word, a derogatory term which is used to make reference to the Japanese Canadians by the Canadian government. So it was actually a derogatory term, which, so this is a very clear evidence of racial discrimination which was said to prevail in Canada towards Japanese. So the timeline that we have for Japanese-Canadian history is everything was perfect right from their settlement. In 1907, they had an anti-Asian riot, and this particular riot was an initiative made by the Canadian people towards Japanese settlement there. The Japanese were quite hardworking, so almost all the jobs were taken over by the Japanese. So, which is something which the Canadians, Canadians who were settled in Canada, they did not love because they were losing their job opportunities. So that was the reason they had this anti-Asian riot. And this particular riot is said to be quite devastating because it is a first reason for the conflict, where we had all the Japanese, most of the Japanese were running stores and shops. So the Japanese stores were completely destroyed and they were stoned. They completely broke and looted all the Japanese stores. The Japanese thought it was just a riot and it was not meant on purpose, but it was actually a riot which was meant for purpose, which the Japanese failed to notice. This was actually an initial nature of, atrocity. We had World War I, 1914, in which Japanese Canadians were fighting on the side of Canada. And the Second World War, which seemed to have begun in 1939, was the complete root cause for all evil which was meted out to the Japanese Canadians, because the World War II, there were few consecutive events which made Canada consider Japanese to be a threat to their nation. So one particular incident is the Pearl Harbor attack. The Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese government, where the American fleets were settled, and two vessels were completely destroyed by the Japanese government. So Japan was actually warring against the American fleet here in Pearl Harbor, but the consequences were meted out by the Japan people who were settled in Canada. So they happened to undergo all the consequences. And the very next day after the Pearl Harbor attack, all their properties were confiscated. Not just properties, their hard-earned property, their immobile assets that they had. Even the radios were confiscated from people because they didn't want the Japanese Canadians to know exactly what was happening in the war scenario, or what exactly is happening in Japan, or what exactly is happening in relation to the war. So they wanted them to be completely ignorant of the war activities, and their properties were completely confiscated. I mean, these hardworking Japanese Canadians, they had so much of assert that they were quite rich, and in no matter of time, all the properties were confiscated and they were left on streets. So this is one particular injustice which has been meted out to the Japanese Canadians. In 1942, we had an internment or a relocation of Japanese Canadians, and this internment is so this is the most painful statement which could be expressed by any Japanese Canadian there. And Joy Kogawa is said to be very much influenced by Muriel Kitagawa's writing, and her work Obasan is considered to be a testimonial literature because these Japanese Canadians did not have their ancestors to pass down the stories of the of one generation to another generation, and most of the details were taken from the letters or the diaries which were written by the Issei and the Issei generation. So they took so much of pain in acquiring all the written materials, and they've collected them, and that is how they've started writing. And so Joy Kukawa's Obasan is said to have created space for immigrant writing and expression in a host land, and it reconstructs history. And Japanese Canadians' writings were inner battles, conflict with the outer spaces, and find an aperture for ventilation. So the next writer is Hiromi Goto. She was born in Japan and migrated to Canada in the year 1969, and her works are Chorus of Mushrooms and The Kappa Child. So Hiromi Goto talks about the different generations of immigrants who has reached Canada and how they differ in their attitudes, the divergent attitudes and the varied responses of each and every generation has been captured by Hiromi Goto. And most of her characters are women. As I told you, why women had so much of space to write, because the men were tasked double than women. Next writer is Carrie Sakamoto. She is a Canadian-born writer, and her works are The Electrical Field and 100 Million Hearts. So she talks about the effects of the internment camps on the Japanese families. So everywhere, the Europeans are said to have a destructing effect on families of communities. So she traces about the effects of internment camps on Japan families, and she talks about in her work 100 Million Hearts. She talks about the journey to Japan to unearth the mysteries of war on the Japanese in Japan and Canada, because most of the Japanese Canadians who were settled in Canada did not know what exactly was happening there to Japan. So she happened to travel back to Japan, and she found out that so much has happened to the Japanese as a result of the nuclear bomb blast, and they were devastated for generations. They found it very hard to revive from all the aftermath of the nuclear explosions. And when I talk about the displacement of families, there is one more reason for one more thing which is added to the displacement. Even before the World War could start, there were few people who happened to move from Canada to Japan for few reasons, like family and other stuff. So those people, like if the children and husband are there, were back in Canada, if the mother has traveled back to Japan, she was not allowed to come back to Canada after the outbreak of war. So this was completely devastating, because those people who have been settled in Japan did not know what has happened, settled in Canada, did not know what has happened to those of their family members who have left for Japan. So when they went back to Japan, they found them all dead, and most of them were in a very bad state, in a very painful state, which can never be verbalized. So literature is said to be the mirror of its time of creation, and I think that is what these Japanese Canadians have been doing. And as a result of so much of their fervent writings, things are said to have quite changed the living conditions of Japanese Canadians in Canada. And 70 years later, people happen to reap the fruits of what they've been underwent. So I guess I've shared another new area of research, which is